We have a quick question here from Yanku asking what would happen if China decided to dump all of its US treasuries. So, as always, thanks for the question, Yanku. Looking at this question, there are basically two parts really. The first one is what would happen if they dump their treasuries, and then based on that, what is the likelihood of that really happening? So, to the first part, what would happen if they did? Now, currently, China holds about 7% of US public debt outstanding, but that has drastically decreased considerably from the almost 14% that they held back in 2011. And it is still way less than half of the size of what is owned by the Federal Reserve alone. Now, dumping that number of treasuries would definitely create a massive amount of turmoil in financial markets and probably cause widespread panic and uncertainty. Now, the biggest challenge it would cause to the US itself is that it will cause their borrowing cost, the US borrowing cost, to drastically spike higher, as the big influx of supply in terms of treasuries or bonds will decrease the bond prices and cause a huge spike or move higher in treasury yields. Now, that is obviously a very big problem for the US economy. As the higher the yields go, the higher the overall credit will become, like mortgages, credit cards, cars, everything. All credit will start to basically cost more and increase, because the US Treasury yield is the benchmark for overall credit in the United States. Now, it could also cause other investors that's also holding treasuries to dump their treasuries as well, and that will obviously cause further drops in the prices. And they will start to unload some of those treasury holdings in the fear that the price will start to drop considerably due to that big influx from China. And that, of course, will cause massive volatility spikes in the fixed income market and cause huge stresses in the financial markets as a whole. Now, there are some speculation that it might also affect the US dollar negatively, as such a big jump in the treasury holdings might erode the investor confidence. But the sheer panic of such a move might actually create demand for the US dollar as a safe haven in times of uncertainty, as well as the prospect of possible higher rates and higher yields could also add to the upside in the dollar. So that is something that might not really have that type of effect. Now, there are a few things the US could do to offset the damage as well, which is worth mentioning. The Fed could, for example, opt to buy a lot of the increased supply in order to mitigate the supply and demand imbalance, and thus try to basically curb the shock it would create to yields and interest rates. But that is obviously just purely speculative from my side. I'm not sure whether they are even allowed to buy that amount. But that is the possible effects that it can have. Obviously, the widespread panic will just cause massive risk of flows. And then turning to, based on that, to the second part, whether China would actually do something like that, it's important to remember that it would certainly hurt the US dollar, but it would also hurt the world economy in ways that would also cause a lot of pain for the Chinese economy as well. So just looking at the US alone, looking at the OEC information we have on this table, we can see that the US is basically 20% or consists 20% of China's total exports. So such a hit to the US economy as well as the world economy would be a massively negative input for China as well. Looking at the trade balance, we can see that they normally export between 2.4 trillion versus 1.5 trillion imports. So a massive knock to their exports from a world panic will obviously be very negative for them as a country as well. Apart from that, the size of their treasury holdings is also important to keep in mind. If they start to suddenly dump a lot of that treasuries, that amount will probably be it'll probably be difficult for them to offload the entire amount in one go or very quickly. Now, that means as they start dumping on mass scale and everybody starts to suddenly notice what is happening, it'll be very difficult for them to quickly offload them quick enough to stop bond prices from dropping. So if they can't drop everything in one go, obviously the value, the remaining value of the treasuries that they still have will start to plummet. So it'll be a very negative thing for them to start offloading it if they can't do it in one go, because that'll decrease the value of the treasuries that they still have on holding. Now, if the treasury dump, let's say it does affect the US dollar negatively as well, it might, if it does, obviously mentioned reasons why it might not affect the dollar negatively, but if it does affect the dollar negatively and the dollar starts to sell off across the board, that'll be very bad for China as well from an export point of view. As the weaker the dollar becomes, it is a negative knock-on effect as it will basically strengthen the Chinese yuan and negatively affect their exports as well. So looking at everything, I would say, in my personal opinion, it would be very unlikely for them to do that, as the negative consequences for China will be just as negative for the US. So it'll be a type of cut your nose to spite your face type of move, and that just seems unlikely for me as a possibility. But anything is possible. We need to be prepared for such a type of move. I think a threat of doing it by maybe dumping a smaller amount, as a threat would probably be enough of a threat to get the US and the world's attention, and would be enough as a leverage to help them with negotiations and stuff like that, as opposed to trying to dump the whole lot. But again, that's just me speculating. But that should give you a little bit more insight on what would happen and what the likelihood is of them actually going forward with something like that.